An historic deal on Iran's nuclear program. Tehran agrees to curb its nuclear activities in exchange for some relief from economic sanctions. Israel has accused Iran of deception and self-delusion. The breakthrough and the backlash. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. So Iran has struck a landmark deal with the United States and 5 world powers to freeze important parts of its nuclear program. The breakthrough came during talks in Geneva and follows a series of high-level, face-to-face talks between the US and Iran over the past year. For its part, Iran will get limited relief on some economic sanctions. The agreement is being hailed as the most significant development between the US and Iran in more than 30 years. It's intended to be a first step towards a more comprehensive nuclear pact to be completed in 6 months. Under the deal, Iran has committed to halt uranium enrichment above 5%, to limit existing stockpiles of enriched uranium, to stop further development of the Arak reactor, and to allow increased inspections of its nuclear sites. In return, the 6 world powers, that's the US, Russia, China, Britain, France and Germany, will provide limited relief of some trade sanctions, said to be worth as much as $7 billion. There'll be no new sanctions for 6 months, and Iran will be granted access to some frozen accounts overseas. But the main sanctions on oil, banking and the financial system will remain in place, and all sanctions would be reinstated if Iran violates the terms of this agreement, with the possibility of more sanctions being imposed.
Today, that diplomacy opened up a new path toward a world that is more secure, a future in which we can verify that Iran's nuclear program is peaceful and that it cannot build a nuclear weapon. While today's announcement is just a first step, it achieves a great deal. For the first time in nearly a decade, we have halted the progress of the Iranian nuclear program.
Meanwhile, Iran's president says his country has finally won the respect it deserves.
The acknowledgement by world powers concerning this right and the elimination of obstacles in the face of the Iranian nation is of great value. The second achievement is the enrichment right by the Iranian nation on Iranian soil. Whatever the interpretation, this right has been explicitly stipulated by this agreement, stressing that Iran will go on with its enrichment program.
All right, let's hear now from Al Jazeera's Soraya Lenny, who's been finding out how this deal is being viewed in Tehran.
The reaction out to Iran is perhaps a little less positive than many people expected, specifically regarding sanctions relief that's offered in this first step agreement. What's offered is around $7 billion, potentially, of Iranian assets and Iranian cash handed back to the Islamic Republic. That Iran has around $100 billion in frozen assets and has lost around $80 billion in just oil revenue since the start of 2012. So this $7 billion is really just pocket change in a petrochemical-based economy like Iran's. But Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, has hailed the deal. He's quite pleased. In just 3 months in office, he's managed to do what his predecessor couldn't do in a decade. The foreign minister as well, heading up that diplomatic mission in Geneva, but they still have to sell this agreement to hardliners here in Iran, and perhaps that might be the most difficult task. Hardliners who think Iran shouldn't even be negotiating for what it sees as its basic rights. But the supreme leader of Iran has also praised this deal, and perhaps that might go some way in appeasing those hardliners here in Iran.
All right, plenty to talk about with our guests today. From Tehran, we're joined by Mohammad Marandi, political analyst and professor at the University of Tehran. Joining us from Jerusalem is Gerald Steinberg, professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University and a former Israeli delegate to the International Atomic Energy Agency academic conferences. And in Washington, D.C., we have Larry Korb, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and former assistant U.S. Secretary of Defense. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. Mohammad Marandi, we'll start with you in Tehran. President Rouhani says that Iran will go on with its enrichment program and that its right to do so has been explicitly stipulated by this agreement. Is he right?
Yes, I think in a way it is That is correct, because up to now the demand has been that Iran relinquish nuclear enrichment altogether, and now they've agreed that over the next 6 months the Iranians continue at current levels with enriching uranium at 3.5 to 5%. The Iranians actually do not want to enrich uranium at 20% anymore because they have enough fuel for the Tehran reactor to produce medical isotopes for cancer patients. And in the first place, the Iranians from the very start didn't want to produce enriched uranium at 20%. They were forced to do so when Western countries refused to provide Iran with the fuel and putting cancer patients at risk. So the Iranians decided to produce their own fuel. But and I think this is a key point, that despite the UN Security Council resolutions, in this agreement in the presence of all the foreign ministers, this was acknowledged. And I think that's basically that after 8 years of resilience from the Iranian perspective, they have finally, the facts on the ground have forced Western governments to recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium, even though this is not explicitly stated. But I think it's there.
Gerald Steinberg in Jerusalem. We know that Israel's Prime Minister and many in the country are far from happy. But does this deal, as John Kerry says, it does make Israel safer?
I think that Mr. Kerry's not going to convince many Israelis. He may not even convince himself and his own team. Let's remember this is an agreement that was reached between the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany with Iran. Israel's not at the table, and in fact Israel's never at the table, because no Iranian official will ever sit at the same table with Israel. We heard the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei talk about Israel as rabid dogs, that Israel needs to be annihilated just last week. This kind of language, coupled with the links to terror groups, the close alliances like Hezbollah, and the efforts to achieve nuclear weapons, and certainly no Israeli, I don't think anybody who looks at the Iranian program from the outside sees it as something that's designed for cancer or other noble civilian activities. This is clearly a military program in defiance of the IAEA and the NPT, and Israelis do not see this agreement as providing a framework which will stop Iran. We have 6 months to see substance, but it seems to be very unlikely, particularly as the sanctions are being reduced, without something serious from Iran in return for that.
Larry Korb, the deal marks arguably the greatest foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration. Let's remember, in the previous 34 years, there'd been barely any official contact between Iran and the US. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's a win-win for both sides. They don't explicitly acknowledge Iran's right to enrich nuclear weapons, but in fact, nuclear material, but in fact they can do it. On the other hand, it stops them. It buys more time to prevent them from having a nuclear breakout, and it also provides a framework to go forward. And I think the most important thing is, as you mentioned in the introduction, it's the beginning of a normalization of relations between the United States and Iran. You know, the United States and Iran, people talk about they haven't dealt with each other for over 30 years. The fact of the matter is, right after 9/11, we worked with the Iranians at the Bonn conference. In fact, had they not persuaded the Northern Alliance to support Karzai, Karzai wouldn't have been in power. And in 2003, they offered to sit down and talk about everything with us, and we rejected it. And each time we rejected it, they have enriched further, and they've gotten more centrifuges. So this stops them, and I think gives us time to get the agreement we need, and should be the beginning of a U.S. and its and the major powers to begin to normalize relations with Iran.
But why now, Larry? What lies behind the Obama administration's motives here? Why has the White House decided that now is the time to bring Iran in from the cold? Is it Iran's influence in the region? Is it the war in Syria?
Well, I think the real thing is, with the defeat, if you will, the end of the term of Ahmadinejad and the election of Rouhani, you now have someone you can work with. And I think it's also the cumulative impact of the sanctions are really beginning to cause economic problems for Iran, and they recognize this can't go on forever. Because remember, these sanctions got really tough after President Obama in his election in 2009 reached out to to Iran and basically was rejected, he was then able to get more sanctions from the international community. And while the U.S. sanctions are important, if the world community doesn't do it, they're not going to work.
Mohammed Marandi, do the repercussions of this deal have the potential, as some commentators have said today, to reshape the Middle East, at least as profoundly as the Arab Spring?
I think it's very important. Yes, I think that it could bring about a major change. Personally, I think that the main reason for this shift is Syria. The United States had worked with the Saudis and others for a very long time on Syria, and they failed. And the situation across the Mediterranean is becoming more unstable. We have more extremists, sectarian extremists, who are funded more or less by countries like Saudi Arabia, which itself promotes a very racist, sectarian and policy, as well as racial hatred. So the situation is becoming a major security concern for Europe and the United States and for the whole world. And the United States, its power is relatively on the decline because of the economic problems that the United States and Europe are facing. And then, you know, the issues of legitimacy, like the wars that have been waged in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course the spying of the United States on allies as well as on Latin America. So the situation across the board is changing, and I think the United States is beginning to recognize that it cannot force Iran to submit. And even despite the sanctions, which are basically American sanctions, not the UN Security Council sanctions, really didn't bite. It was American sanctions that were very severe. But even then, the Iranians have so far, and I'm pretty sure from here onwards, they will not relinquish their rights within the framework of the NPT. And I think for every time the Americans add new sanctions, the Iranians push the nuclear program further ahead with greater speed. So I think the Iranians are trying to tell the Americans that, look, you cannot make us bow, but if you talk with us, if you treat us with respect, then we can move towards rapprochement. And I think that this is something that obviously the Israeli regime is getting very angry about, because they like to demonize Iran for their own interest. They distort the reality, such as the distortion of the speech of Ayatollah Khamenei the other day. He never said destroy Israel as in the military sense. The Iranian policy on Israel has been that it's an apartheid state and it must cease to exist as an apartheid state, just like apartheid South Africa.
I know that both Gerald Steinberg and Larry Korb want to come back on what they've just heard there, but I'm going to pause for a moment to listen to what US Secretary of State John Kerry had to say on Israel for a moment.
It will make our partners in the region safer. It will make our ally Israel safer. Now, this has been a difficult and a prolonged process. It's been difficult for us, it's been difficult for our allies, and it's obviously been difficult for the government of Iran.
Well, let's now hear the response from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Speaking on Sunday, he said, "What was achieved last night in Geneva is not a historic agreement, it's a historic mistake. Today, the world has become a much more dangerous place because the most dangerous regime in the world has taken a significant step towards attaining the most dangerous weapon in the world." More now from Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna in Jerusalem.
There was only anger in Israel's corridors of power. A grim-faced Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stalked into the cabinet meeting, a scheduled one this Sunday. He told his ministers that this was a historical mistake. He insisted that Israel would not be in any way bound by the deal that was reached in Geneva. Earlier in the morning, his Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman had told Israel Radio that this deal changes the status quo in the region. He was asked directly whether Israel would now contemplate military action. Lieberman said, well, Israel now sees things differently. So great anger from the Israeli politicians, the Israeli government. However, they making very clear what they objected to. The precise terms of the deal, they said, left Iran with operating centrifuges, it left it with enriched uranium, and it left the heavy water nuclear plant at Arak completely untouched. Well, certainly no listening whatsoever to the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, who's argued not only in Geneva but also in recent weeks here in Israel that this is a deal that does not threaten Israel. In fact, it guarantees its security. That is certainly not the way it is seen in West Jerusalem.
Gerald Steinberg in Jerusalem. Is there a sense there in Israel that the US allies have somehow lost their minds, that the view in Washington today is that Iran has gone through a transformation and has become a functioning nation state rather than the old view of a revolutionary theocracy dedicated to confronting America at any cost? Is either of those views the right one?
Well, certainly the revolutionary theocracy, a group of leaders behind a curtain that have no real knowledge of the kind of dangers they're going to get into with nuclear weapons. I teach the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was 51 years ago. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev almost blew up the world, and they had embassies in each other's capitals. They had ability to talk to each other in various ways. The Ayatollahs in Tehran have no concept of what Israel's about. Unfortunately, we've heard Mr. Marandi talk about Israel also using language that shows that he has no clue about what he's talking about. That's not what you want to have a nuclear confrontation over. You want to be able to have direct communications. You want to avoid these kind of confrontations. You don't want to have allies like Hezbollah, a massive terrorist group with tens of thousands of rockets, and the kind of language, racist, absolutely hate-filled language that comes across. So those are all elements of this, and the concern in Israel is that America, not that they've lost their mind, but this is an America that's withdrawing into isolation. This is an America that promises you'll not be alone, but in fact withdrawing from Iraq, Afghanistan, exhausted, and distributing promises that they can't possibly keep. So the United States unfortunately looks to be, from a dominant Israeli view, taking the easy way out for itself. But of course we'll see in the next 6 months. If Iran starts to play games with the IAEA, as is likely, if it follows the North Korean route, which is likely, if Mr. Rouhani does what he did with the Europeans, which is to wind them up into little circles but not produce anything in ways of substantial halt to this illegal, illicit nuclear program, then Israel maintains and says very explicitly the military option, and that's something that is very much on the table.
Okay, Mohammed Marandi, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think the only country here that constantly threatens other countries is Israel, and we see that from the statements made by your guest. The military option is, of course, not a realistic one, because if Israel attacks Iran, Israel will be on the receiving end of legitimate retaliation. It will be condemned and seen as an aggressor, and it would lose. But the Iranians have never threatened the Israeli regime. They've simply said what even the former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Well, if your guest would tolerate my statements just as I tolerated him, it'd be a good idea. Just as the U.S. President Jimmy Carter spoke of apartheid, I think when an American president admits as much about Israel, then I think the rest of the world knows exactly where the Israeli regime stands. But beyond that, I think the important thing to note is that from the very beginning, the Iranians never had the intention to develop a nuclear weapon, unlike Israel, which has hundreds. The Iranian nuclear program, the IAEA, has never shown any evidence whatsoever that the Iranian nuclear program is anything but peaceful. The non-aligned movement, which constitutes 3/5 of the countries of the world, have always supported the Iranian position. The Russians and the Chinese have said the Iranians have never been after a nuclear weapon. Even the American intelligence, as the 16 organizations have said repeatedly, that Iran's nuclear program, there's no deviation and it's peaceful. So the Iranians are not worried about having intrusive inspections. And it is basically regimes like Israel which want greater tension and which create, and other regimes perhaps like Saudi Arabia, that have a crisis of legitimacy, that want to create a crisis and have it continue.
Okay, Gerald, a quick response from you, please, because I want to get back to Larry Corbyn in Washington, D.C.
Well, I don't think it's useful to invent history, as my colleague just did, and then for me to refute each point. The only country that's been held in violation of its NPT commitments repeatedly is Iran. The Security Council has found them in non-compliance. They have violated, they've played games with completely. They've destroyed the NPT, and unfortunately now this agreement has all of the markings, unless it's actually accompanied by some teeth in the next 6 months of saying the NPT just doesn't exist anymore, and we will soon see Saudi Arabia, Turkey, other countries also developing nuclear capabilities if Iran does that extra small step that is necessary with its 20% enriched uranium to go to making a full-fledged bombing capability. So the propaganda aside, these are real threats in a very dangerous
someone
region.
From Israel to talk about the NPT. The Israeli regime isn't even a member of the NPT, and it has nuclear weapons, and they have the audacity to talk about the NPT.
Okay,
which is exactly this kind of exchange tells us the dangers in the region.
You're talking about
really
the nuclear non-proliferation treaty there. Larry Korb in Washington, D.C. Is this deal a strategic masterstroke or a reckless gamble by Obama? You touched on this point a little earlier. I'm thinking of Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Now seen as a transformative, an example of transformative diplomacy, but at the time was seen as something of a risky bet. Is there a strategic vision here on the part of Obama, or do you give any sway to the skeptics who say that all he's doing is trying to prevent Iran preventing a bomb while he's in office and can pass the dilemma over to whoever succeeds him?
No, I think this is a strategic, a really smart strategic step on Obama's part. We've got to, at some point, bring Iran back into the family of nations. It's a very large country. It's got a great civilization. Both Israel and the United States had worked with that throughout history. In fact, Israel used to have the largest embassy in Tehran. So it's not an idea that they've never been part of the international system. I would also liken this to the president I work for, President Reagan, when he reached out to negotiate with Gorbachev. People in this country accused him of being Neville Chamberlain. And this idea that the United States is going into isolation is nonsense. We left Iraq basically after the Iraqis asked us to leave. We had been there almost a decade, given that country a chance to make their own decisions. The same way in Afghanistan, we're taught our major combat mission is ending next year, but we're willing to stay there another 10 years. We still have the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, so we're still very militarily involved. We overextended ourselves after 9/11 by trying to remake societies. And one thing I think is important here has sort of been missed. After the Iranians worked with us to help put Karzai in, and read what Ryan Crocker, who was ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan, said about that, President Bush, for some unknown reason, put him on the axis of evil. And in my view, they then decided, well, we better, accelerate our program because we're going to be next, And in fact, there were people in this country who wanted to go into Iran, assuming that, Iraq went well. So this whole idea, where really this is the beginning of a new era, just like Nixon to China and Reagan with Gorbachev.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time here. Gerald Steinberg, what will Israel's next move be, do you think, on this? Is there something more going on here as well? Is there an insecurity perhaps on Israel's part that over whether any thawing of relations between Washington and Iran will be at its expense and the relationship that it has with the US?
There's always insecurity in Israel. Israel is a very tiny country, and we hear the language, the rhetoric of hatred coming from Iran, from elsewhere, from Hezbollah, all the rockets that are aimed at Israel. Israel's lived in a situation of war and attacks since 1948. So there is a natural insecurity, and I don't think that President Obama and certainly Secretary of State Kerry have done more than provide words to reassure Israel. Israel wants to see where this is going in the next 6 months. There is a chance that, in fact, Lawrence Korb's very optimistic scenario will at least partially be implemented. If Iran backs down, if Iran gives up that 20% enriched uranium, I don't care about the rhetoric, I care about the substance. Israelis care about what's going on. If Iran does become part of the family of nations, if Iran stops the mass killing that goes on via Hezbollah in Syria, then of course we will see a different Middle East. But we've been burned many times before, and let's be realistic about the nature of this regime and the dangers that are posed. I think the Obama administration has to work pretty hard now to show Israel that, in fact, it is capable of the type of intervention that Lawrence Korb talked about.
Gentlemen, I know that Mohammed Marandi and Larry Korb would probably want to respond to that. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Mohammed Marandi, Gerald Steinberg and Larry Korb, thank you to you all for being part of today's Inside Story. And just a reminder, you can find this program and many more at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And why not leave us a comment or like us there while you're at it. Once again, thanks for watching. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. Bye for now.